Losing just seems to be in some candidates' blood. For some, they decide that once is enough. For others, they give it a second go, but then realize that winning is not for them. But some go even further. Some realize the third time is a charm, or maybe it isn't. And for today's video, we're talking about a candidate that many think fits into that third losing category. Well, he was actually a four-time winner, but also a three-time loser, or was he? In today's video, we're going to talk about the ups and downs of the electoral career of Nelson A. Rockefeller, a four-time winner as governor of New York and three-time Republican presidential primary loser, or was he? Hello, my name is Dave and welcome to Election History. I do videos about campaigns, elections, candidates, political parties, and the likes. If this is something that you enjoy, please subscribe to the channel and comment down below. If you would like to help out this channel more, you can become a member of my Patreon. The Patreon producer this week is Anastasia Beaverhausen. It's people like Anastasia who allow me to take more time to make these videos. And with that, let's talk about the electoral history of Nelson A. Rockefeller. It goes without saying, probably, but Nelson Rockefeller is the grandson of oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller. And though his early life focused on working in his father's financial endeavors, his true passion was politics. Still, during this time, Rockefeller worked quite extensively in Latin America, building his love for the region and eventually learning Spanish fluently. Before running for public office for the first time, Rockefeller was involved with President Franklin Roosevelt's efforts to prevent the spread of Nazi influence in Latin America. He first worked with Roosevelt's administration as the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, which worked to build those relationships. After serving in that capacity for a few years, he moved on to being the Assistant Secretary of State for American Republic Affairs, in which he essentially had the same role as previously. Even though the goals of his new job were essentially the same, the fact that he was now connected to the Department of State meant that he could negotiate with Latin American countries in an official capacity. After World War II, Nelson Rockefeller was instrumental in building the United States' relations with other countries, but was eventually removed from his positions by the new president, Harry S. Truman, though Truman would later appoint him as the chairman of the International Development Advisory Board, which sought to provide technical assistance to developing countries in Latin America, as well as in Africa, the Middle East, and South Central Asia. After the Truman administration, he worked with the new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, to help create the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which would eventually be known as the Department of Health and Human Services. In 1954, Rockefeller became Eisenhower's special assistant on foreign affairs. This was quite an important position as the future of American politics in the post-World War II world was still being hammered out, with the new perceived threat to the United States being the spread of communism. John Foster Dulles believed in creating a strong nuclear arsenal to deter any attacks, especially from the newly emerging nuclear power of the Soviet Union. This approach was too narrow, according to Rockefeller, and didn't address the spread of communism to other nations, particularly within the sphere of influence of the United States. Instead, Rockefeller supported building a larger conventional army, greater covert operations, pro-American and anti-communist propaganda, but also providing economic aid and, in some cases, military assistance to countries that could fall under Soviet influence. This gave Rockefeller the image of being level-headed and providing rational solutions to difficult problems. Of course, Rockefeller had his own political ambitions. Yes, he had the money, but as long as he wasn't an elected official or a high-profile cabinet member, he would never be able to realize these political ambitions. With that, Rockefeller resigned from the federal government and prepared for a gubernatorial run in New York in 1958 against Democrat Averell Harriman. Harriman was a typical New York Democrat, rich, well-connected, and aligned with the Franklin Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party. He eventually became highly involved with negotiations between the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union as far as the state of Europe after World War II. He too supported the Rockefeller approach to the new post-war world, but was much more aggressive, supporting assassinations, coups and supported economic suppression over investment, which was Rockefeller's approach. However, the rivalry between Harriman and Rockefeller would now begin in state politics. In 1956, Rockefeller was appointed chairman of the Temporary State Commission on the Constitutional Convention, which sought to update the state's constitution. But in a political power play move, Harriman vetoed a bill that would have kept Rockefeller on as the chair of the committee. While this was a pure attack against Rockefeller, it was also a move to lessen Republican influence within the commission, as well as solidify any constitutional revision process with the executive. But since Republicans were both in control of the New York State Senate and State Assembly, the Republicans simply created their own committees in their own chambers, which didn't need approval from the governor. Up until this time, Rockefeller was a diplomat and an administrator, and not a politician. Therefore, his first goal was for him to be known by not just potential voters, but with the Republican Party itself. When it came to the Republican Party, Rockefeller was pretty much set to be their nominee. But in New York, there is also the Liberal Party, which was very much to the left at the time and strongly connected to labor. It was thought that if Rockefeller became the nominee of the Liberal Party, he could help finance the party. During his time in the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, Rockefeller became a protege of Ann Rosenberg, Truman's Assistant Secretary of Defense. Rosenberg was also closely associated with David Dubinsky, the leader of the Liberal Party, but someone who worked in the Harriman administration. Remember, while the Rockefeller family had a reputation of being anti-labor, especially his father and grandfather, his, Nelson's, views on unions and workers' issues were still somewhat unknown. But in the end, the Liberal Party went with Harriman. As with any good gubernatorial battle, there's always a budget crisis in the middle. During Harriman's time as governor, he had difficulty working with the Republican legislature when it came to passing a budget. The 1958 budget projected a large $200 to $300 million gap due to the recession of 1957 and 1958. When it came to Harriman's approach to the budget, he wanted to keep government spending at either the same levels or even increase spending by raising state and corporate income tax. Unfortunately for Harriman, the Republicans held both legislative chambers and were focused on making sure that Harriman didn't get his budget until he proposed some spending cuts. As for Rockefeller, he stated that the biggest problem with the budget was mismanagement, and that both a mixture of tax and budget cuts would lead to a renewed economic growth in the state. And while he had been doing all but announcing that he was running for governor, he officially announced his run on June 30th, 1958. Rockefeller would win the nomination in late August and then start campaigning hard from that point on. His chief campaign strategist was Anna Rosenberg, who we mentioned before, and who was highly influential in Democratic politics. Having Rosenberg on Rockefeller's side indicated a break in the Democratic ranks. She mainly helped Rockefeller when it came to messaging with traditionally Democratic voting blocs, particularly Union, Jewish, and urban liberal voters. She also worked to help build coalitions with minority voters in the Black and Hispanic communities. This would give Rockefeller a friendly image to groups that had traditionally been hostile to Republicans. These early moves in his career would eventually shape his image in future elections. But in addition to bringing in non-traditional voters, he also campaigned on his administrative experience as well as his moderate politics. As far as his campaign, it was modern and utilized public opinion polling, public relation firms, and extensive modern media outreach, which included television, the emerging powerhouse medium. On election day, Rockefeller would win by nearly 11%. His main strength came from lowering the Democratic margins in New York City. Though Harriman dominated the Bronx and Brooklyn, Rockefeller lowered margins in Queens and Manhattan and won Staten Island. But even with this victory, many in New York media assumed that this was purely a stepping stone for Rockefeller to run for president, and just 2 years later, he wouldn't disappoint. Now, in the introduction of this video, I said that Rockefeller might be a 3-time presidential loser, but calling the 1960 election one that Rockefeller lost would admittedly be a stretch. During this election cycle, Rockefeller never announced that he was running for president, but constantly made threats to challenge Vice President Richard Nixon. But in the end, Rockefeller never announced and never ran. But why were people talking about Rockefeller running in the first place? As has already been mentioned, Rockefeller supported increased conventional military spending. During his last term as president, Dwight Eisenhower advocated for vast decreases in military spending. While Richard Nixon might not have necessarily agreed with Eisenhower, he was connected to the president's policies. Another reason that he was being considered was that he was now the governor of New York, which, along with California, was also considered a stepping stone to the presidency. Oh, and remember to watch my recent video about the 2003 race for governor in California. During his short time as governor, which was less than a year when speculation about his running for president arose, Rockefeller increased taxes to maintain state spending. This wasn't what he campaigned on when he ran for governor, saying that tax cuts would help spur the economy. Even with tax increases, he was seen as being fiscally responsible and not just doing whatever was considered popular. Also, New York was on its way to having the first balanced budget in nearly 30 years. These spending increases, which usually helped poorer and minority neighborhoods, made Rockefeller seem more liberal than most potential Democratic candidates, with the exception of Hubert Humphrey. So yes, I'm saying that Rockefeller came off as more liberal than John F. Kennedy. The presumed Republican successor to Eisenhower was Richard Nixon, but many worried that Eisenhower was unpopular, which would directly impact Nixon in the general election. The 1958 elections didn't go well nationally, with Democrats picking up 15 Senate and 49 House seats in one of the biggest landslides in recent history. If this was the political climate that Nixon was entering, he was vulnerable to an opponent that was openly opposed to some of Eisenhower's policies, like Rockefeller. On top of that, Rockefeller had a lot of money that he could spend in his campaigns. And as was already mentioned, he had already built a reputation of being a left-of-center Republican that could not only reshape the Republican Party, but also defeat any potential Democratic candidates. However, the polling wasn't showing this was the case. In a Gallup poll conducted in November, presumptive Democratic nominee, Senator John F. Kennedy, was easily defeating Rockefeller by 10%, 55% to 45%. Still, considering the same poll showed that Kennedy was winning in July by 26%, which was 63% to 37%, it was a closing of the gap. Serious speculation as to whether Rockefeller was going to run or not started in early December of 1959 when he toured the country to see if a presidential run was viable. He started off talking to voters in New Hampshire and made his way from California over to the Midwest, to Wisconsin, to Illinois, and then finally back to the East Coast. But after returning to Albany, Rockefeller said that he would not be running for the presidency in 1960. Essentially, he was convinced by his tour that potential delegates at a national convention were opposed to his candidacy for the Republican nomination. As a result, he would have to run a massive underdog campaign, which would take time away from his obligations as governor of New York. Rockefeller said, quote, "My conclusion, therefore, is that I am not and shall not be a candidate for the nomination for the presidency. This decision is definite and final." End quote. After this announcement, most of the news about Rockefeller was about his battle with New York City Mayor Robert Wagner over the issue of increased taxes. Rockefeller, the Republican, supported increasing taxes, while Wagner, the Democrat, opposed any increases. But even though Rockefeller said that his decision to not enter the presidential race was final, there was still a buzz as to whether he would enter the race late or not. And there was a good reason for this. Even though Rockefeller said he wouldn't run, he was still visiting early primary states to meet voters, which is an odd thing to do if you have no intention of running for president. But with these appearances, a draft Rockefeller movement started to swell right before the Republican convention. On June 8, 1960, Rockefeller wrote a 2,700-page political statement in which he asked Vice President Nixon to provide a clear program and policy before his nomination. Rockefeller also stated that he would be leading the New York State delegation, indicating that Rockefeller could be a favorite son candidate. A favorite son candidate is when one person, usually an elected official, controls a state's delegation to the national convention. While this is more prominent in Democratic politics, it did happen in Republican politics as well. Still, even with that being the case, Rockefeller thought that Nixon was more concerned about winning the election instead of providing good public policy and wanted Nixon to answer to criticism. Now, like I do in many videos, I want to slam Wikipedia a little bit. Don't get me wrong, I like Wikipedia and it helps me find sources for my videos, but many times it's just flat wrong. If you look at the page regarding the 1960 Republican presidential primaries, it said that Rockefeller suspended his campaign on December 26, 1959. But that is not true, as he wasn't campaigning and just indicated that he wasn't going to run. It is also stated that he re-entered the race on June 8, 1960. Again, that is incorrect, as that was just the day that he released that statement that I just mentioned. So again, always double check what you see on Wikipedia. Another misconception regarding the clash between Rockefeller and Nixon was that Rockefeller would win the Republican nomination over Nixon, but nothing could be further from the truth. By June, Nixon already had 911 delegates, with only 666 needed for the nomination. Therefore, the attacks didn't hurt Nixon at the convention, but possibly in the general election. Therefore, it was better to get Rockefeller on Nixon's side and support the Republican ticket instead of constantly being a thorn in the side of the Republican nominee. But at the Republican convention, it was possible for liberal Republicans, led by Rockefeller, to challenge Nixon's platform at the convention. When the platform committee met, Rockefeller people clashed with other Republicans wanting a platform strong on civil rights and defense. If they didn't get what they wanted in the committee, they could fight the platform on the floor of the convention, as well as start a draft Rockefeller movement. Remember, he wasn't officially a candidate for the presidency. But on July 22nd, the day that the platform committee met, Nixon called Rockefeller to see if the two could meet in New York, which Rockefeller agreed. At the meeting, Nixon asked Rockefeller to be his running mate, with Rockefeller saying no. Then the two agreed to a platform, called the platform committee in the middle of the night, and read them the platform. The two men then told their supporters to support the compromise, which would later be known as the Treaty or the Truce of Fifth Avenue. With that, the two men were no longer at war, and Rockefeller even introduced Nixon at the National Convention a few days later. If you would like to know more about what happened regarding the convention and platform committee, I highly recommend reading The Making of the President 1960 by Theodore White, or watch the documentary, which has a shorter version. I will put the links down below in the description. And by the way, any of Theodore White's books about presidential elections, whether it be 60, 64, 68, or 72, are great reads, and I highly recommend them. The day after the agreement, the New York Times summed it up by saying, quote, "For what Mr. Nixon really wanted was not Rockefeller, but New York's 45 electoral votes. Not merely Rockefeller's word, but Rockefeller's votes amongst the anti-Kennedy Democrats and independents. His hope was that a reconciliation on the platform would lead to a Nixon-Rockefeller alliance, but all he got was a truce." End quote. And that is the end of Rockefeller's so-called presidential run in 1960. As I said earlier, to say that Rockefeller ran for president in 1960 is an extreme stretch, and I would argue factually incorrect. But now you know the story. With that, Rockefeller was up for re-election as governor in 1962. As we already established, Nelson Rockefeller was one of the most liberal Republicans in the nation. Regarding social issues, he was a strong supporter of the civil rights movement. When it comes to economic issues, he was more than willing to increase taxes to maintain social spending, but to also balance a budget. When it came to foreign policy, it's hard to say whether Rockefeller was left or right. Both sides had their interventionist and isolationist wings, which really hasn't changed over the last 60 plus years. Still, Rockefeller was on the left of the political spectrum. For the traditional conservative, there wasn't much room in New York politics. This would lead to the formation of the Conservative Party of New York State, which was basically Republicans who opposed Rockefeller for being too liberal. Of course, this could be an issue for Rockefeller, as voters on the right who would otherwise vote for Rockefeller might now support the newly formed conservatives. Additionally, since fusion tickets were allowed, meaning that one candidate could run under the banner of multiple parties and receive votes from all the parties who display the candidate's name, the conservatives could team up with another party simply to stop Rockefeller. But they didn't do that, and instead ran Syracuse businessman David H. Jackwith as their candidate. Overall, citizens approve of Rockefeller and his national favorability rating around 60%. He would easily win the 1962 election with 53.1% of the vote, 13.3% ahead of his Democratic opponent, Robert Morgenthau, who was also on the ballot for the Liberal Party. Conservative Party candidate David Jackwith only received 2.4% of the votes. With this easy re-election effort, he was yet again considered a frontrunner for the Republican nomination for president in 1964. Regardless of whether the Democratic candidate was John F. Kennedy or Lyndon Baines Johnson, it really didn't matter. Whoever the Democrats nominated would have easily defeated the Republican candidates. With that backdrop, Richard Nixon, who had been considered the frontrunner for the Republican nomination if he were to seek the presidency again, decided not to run and instead ran for governor of California, which is an entire video in and of itself. Still, the first candidate to announce that he was seeking the nomination was Nelson Rockefeller on November 7, 1963, just 2 weeks before Kennedy's assassination. But even with his easy re-election as governor just a year before, not everything was rosy for Rockefeller. On March 16, 1962, Mary Rockefeller was granted a divorce from Nelson due to extreme mental cruelty. With her 2 sons accompanying her, it did appear as that the family also supported this decision. If that wasn't bad enough, he married Margarita Happy Murphy on May 4, 1963. There were 2 reasons why this was an issue. First of all, religious conservatives were already making inroads into the Republican Party, and divorce and remarriage were looked down upon. However, the biggest reason it was a problem was because Happy Rockefeller was a former staffer of Nelson, as well as 17 years younger than Nelson. It looked more like his divorce was so that he could hook up with a younger wife. While not officially a candidate, Barry Goldwater was seen as Rockefeller's primary opponent as soon as Nixon said that he was going to run for governor. But as soon as the news of Rockefeller's marriage circulated around the nation, Rockefeller's polling numbers plummeted. Before the news, the Gallup poll showed Rockefeller at 43% to Goldwater's 26%, with Michigan Governor George Romney polling at 13%. But during the week of the marriage, in a poll conducted on May 2nd through May 7th, Goldwater jumped into the lead at 40%, with Rockefeller losing 14% and now at 29%, and Romney at 16%. A week later, Romney was now in the mix, with Goldwater now at 35%, Rockefeller at 30%, and Romney at 22%. It was likely that a lot of Rockefeller support was going to shift over to Romney. Just 1 week before Rocky announced his candidacy, another Gallup poll came out showing Goldwater polling at 45% to Rockefeller's 23%. Even independents started to poll for Goldwater, with the Arizona senator polling at 33% of independents and Rockefeller at 27%. Romney was still polling in the teens, but he would announce that he would not run in January of 1964. Former vice presidential candidate Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. jumped into the race with support of former President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Interestingly, at the time, Lodge was the U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam. He never actively campaigned for the position and stayed in Saigon to carry out his responsibilities as ambassador. Even with being in Southeast Asia, Lodge won the New Hampshire primary. Even after the win, Lodge said that he was not going to return to the United States and campaign and was going to stay in South Vietnam. But the candidate that finished second place was Barry Goldwater and not Nelson Rockefeller. Most media at this time said that his remarriage was still plaguing his campaign. From this point forward, Rockefeller continued to drop. In most Gallup polls, Rockefeller polled in the single digits. He did win the most delegates in his home state of New York, but not much more. He did win all the delegates in West Virginia, but he was the only candidate on the ballot. Even though Goldwater was the winner of most of the primaries and state conventions, a majority of the delegates to the National Republican Convention were still unpledged. This gave either Rockefeller or Pennsylvania Governor William Scranton, who was also a candidate for the presidency, challenging Goldwater on the floor of the convention. Moderate and liberal Republicans could also hold up the platform like they had in 1960. But in the end, Goldwater was able to gain the support of a number of Republican national leaders and dominate the convention. Rockefeller said that he could not support Goldwater as president, saying that he was an extremist and worried about the direction of the country.
Precisely 1 year ago today, on July 14, 1963, I warned that the Republican Party is in real danger of subversion by a radical, well-financed, highly disciplined majority. Wholly alien to the sound and honest Republican liberalism that has kept this party abreast of human needs. Some of you don't like to hear it, ladies and gentlemen, but it's the truth.
Goldwater would go on to lose to President Johnson in the largest popular vote landslide since Franklin Roosevelt in 1936. If you would like to read more about Rocky's 1964 run, I highly recommend reading a graduate paper by Christopher Eller from Winthrop University called Running from Behind: Nelson Rockefeller and the Liberal Republicans During the 1964 Republican Primaries. I'll link it in the description below. Returning to New York, Rockefeller still had governed as a center-left Republican. Yes, there were some areas where he was conservative, such as being labeled as a law and order candidate, an image that was becoming increasingly important in the mid and late 1960s, but for the most part, he was a liberal when it came to government spending, making it easy for him to work with the legislature, with both chambers flipping over to the Democrats after their 1964 landslide victory. After his remarriage in 1963 and his refusal to endorse Goldwater in 1964, many in the Republican Party in New York didn't like Rocky. This led to more defections over to the Conservative Party, which was becoming more of a political force. Their potential role as spoiler came in the 1965 New York election for mayor, as conservative writer William F. Buckley received 13.4% of the vote. Granted, Republican, Liberal, and Fusion candidate John Lindsay was elected by 4%, but it did show that the Conservatives had electoral power. But another monkey wrench that was thrown into the race for governor was that the Liberal Party was going to run their own candidate. Ever since the party was founded in 1944, the Liberal Party had always nominated the candidate who was also the Democratic nominee. However, in 1966, the Liberal Party nominated a big name, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. Of course, he was a Roosevelt, but also closely connected to the Kennedy and Johnson administration. Had the Liberal Party stayed with the Democratic candidate, Frank O'Connor, then the Democrats might have beaten Rockefeller. But the four-way split between the Democrats, Republicans, Liberals, and Conservatives meant that either Rockefeller or O'Connor could be elected as governor. Overall, the election was based more on ideology and partisanship than it was about issues. Those voting on partisanship voted Democrat or Republican, while ideologues would vote for the Liberals or Conservatives. Just days before the election, a Daily News poll showed that O'Connor was leading Rockefeller by 3.5%, with O'Connor claiming that he would win the election by a 300,000 vote margin the day before the election. But in the end, it was Nelson Rockefeller winning by nearly 400,000 votes and his third consecutive term as governor. Even with the win, he only received 44.6% of the votes, the lowest vote total in his career. With another term as governor under his belt, just like clockwork, it was time for another presidential run. But after a poor performance in the gubernatorial election, as well as the problems still stemming from 1963 and 1964, Rockefeller wasn't nearly the political heavyweight that he was in 1964. Prior to his remarriage, he was the odds-on favorite to be the Republican nominee that year, though any candidate would have lost to the Democratic candidate. But now his position as the leading Republican in his own state was even being challenged by Republican and liberal New York Mayor John Lindsay. Interestingly, Lindsay's supporters backed Rockefeller's nomination run, feeling that it would be better if he was out of the state. Writer William S. White said, quote, "The thing has gone so far, to be sure, that Rockefeller has felt compelled publicly to call upon the Lindsay people to quit loving him so much and specifically to stop trying to force the non-candidacy of Nelson Rockefeller into an open candidacy." End quote. And that was true. In late 1967, Rockefeller wasn't a candidate for president. In fact, he supported George Romney for the Republican nomination in December of 1967. This was even after Romney's brainwashing comment, in which Romney said, quote, "When I came back from Vietnam, I just had the greatest brainwashing that anybody can get." End quote. In fact, Romney was the frontrunner during much of 1966. But once the brainwashing remark became highly publicized, Romney started dropping in the polls. Many saw Rockefeller as the candidate that could fill any hole that Romney left. Two other candidates running for the Republican nomination were Richard Nixon and current California Governor Ronald Reagan. As for Rockefeller, he could have easily used the quote that Reagan had used a few years earlier, which is that he didn't leave the party, but the party left him. By 1968, the Republican Party had shifted significantly to the right, with Rockefeller's political views way outside the mainstream of national Republican politics. The emergence of Ronald Reagan on the national scene was a sign of the shift. Even Richard Nixon, who had always campaigned as a centrist Republican, was also shifting to the right, though he would eventually govern like a moderate. Still, back to Rockefeller, it was just a fact that he was too liberal to be considered seriously as a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. As with 1960, Rockefeller never officially announced that he was running for president, though campaigned as if he was. He never officially appeared on any primary ballots, though he did win a plurality of the votes and delegates in the Massachusetts Republican primary, though all of the candidates were write-in candidates. He would eventually win 78 delegates from his home state of New York and could almost be considered more of a favorite son for New York with a few extra delegates. Interestingly, his brother, Winthrop Rockefeller, was governor of Arkansas and the state's favorite son. He was expected to give his votes to Nelson on the second ballot, but Nixon would eventually win after first ballot switches, though many could consider this a second ballot. Rockefeller did have the second highest number of delegates, but it wasn't enough to impact the platform or the nomination, making this Rockefeller's last run for president. He had considered running in 1976, but he didn't. I talk more about that situation in my video about the 1976 Republican primaries. Rockefeller's last run for governor of New York would be in 1970, which was an uneventful election in the state. Well, with the exception of Conservative Party candidate James L. Buckley, brother of William F. Buckley, being elected to the U.S. Senate by just under 2%. But for Rockefeller, he was expected to win, even with an impressive conservative performance in the U.S. Senate race. He would win by 12.1% over Democrat Arthur Goldberg, with Conservative Party candidate Paul L. Adams receiving 7%. Honestly, I would have liked to put more about this race into the video, but it's really hard to find anything that defines the race. With that, I'll go with what Emmett N. O'Brien from the Gannett News Services wrote. Quote, "Rockefeller goes in as a favorite, bolstered by his incumbency, his slick organizations, the endorsement of most of the newspapers in the state, organized labor, and many clergymen, and by the New York Daily News poll. Goldberg, former United Nations ambassador, former Supreme Court justice, former Secretary of Labor, and one-time counsel to the top labor union, has had difficulty coming across to voters. End quote. After that, Rockefeller returns to Albany, then there's Watergate, then Nixon resigns, then Ford becomes president, and Rocky becomes vice president. To close out this video, I think we need to clear up one misconception, which I tried to do throughout this video. We always think of Rockefeller as a 3-time presidential loser, but he really wasn't. His only true official run was in 1964. His 1960 effort was to force the party to adopt his ideas, with the 1968 attempt looking more like a traveling show than any serious run at the presidency. So, to me, calling him a 3-time loser is incorrect. However, we do have a what if. What if Rockefeller didn't get remarried? Would he have won the Republican nomination? If he had won the Republican nomination, even if he lost heavily to Lyndon Johnson, would the Republican Party have moved as quickly to the right? Could he have been the 1968 nominee? Could he have been president? Put your comments below. Personally, I think if we want to talk about the genesis of ideological and partisan sorting in American politics, I think it starts with the Rockefeller push for a liberal platform in 1960. In reality, the 1960 platform battle was a Rockefeller versus Goldwater battle, not a Nixon battle. Again, let me know what you think. And with that, thank you for watching today's video. Remember, you can support the channel by joining my Patreon with a link in the description below. If you want to watch the video about the 1976 Republican primary, check out the video on the left. If you want to learn more about another presidential candidate from New York, sort of, check out the video on the right about Bobby Kennedy's campaign in 1968. See you in the next video, and bye for now.